All right, today we are going to talk about the Revolutionary War. Yesterday we talked about the sort of life in the colonies at the time of the American founding. And one of the things you'll notice that I didn't talk about is the British involvement. That's because Britain was in many places, and in most places actually, and in many ways, uninvolved in what the colonists did. Beginning in the end of the colonial era, however, the colonies became more and more valuable. They started making more and more money, and Britain decided they wanted more and more control. And so this caused a lot of tensions that led to the war. So I wanted to just go through a number of the characters that we're going to be talking about here before we start. And there's really too many to talk about, so we're just going to talk about a few. First, obviously, here we have George Washington. These portraits I'm going to show you of a lot of the famous people are portraits when they are old men. And you'll see some pictures of George Washington as a young man as we go through, or a younger man in some of his military pictures. But this is when he was the president. So this is George Washington, the greatest man in American history. And as King George III said, one of the greatest men in the history of the world. We'll talk some more about him and what he did as we go on. But he was remember, he grew up in Virginia. He had a large farm in Virginia, and he liked his farm. He wanted to be on his farm. He was something of a philosopher and also a soldier. He was a successful soldier as a young man, and he got into politics, and he ended up being the general of the Army of the Revolution and also the first president of the United States under the Constitution. So, it's George Washington. We have Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was known as the most famous American in the world at his time. We don't think of Benjamin Franklin as the most famous American, but Benjamin Franklin had a couple of things going for him that the others did not. He was famous worldwide as a scientist and inventor. You guys remember some of the stories we talked about Ben Franklin being a young man and learning. You remember he would read books all the time, and he loved to learn. And he would do all sorts of experiments and investigations, remember, with the ants, and then most famously later with lightning and electricity. And so he was known worldwide as a scientist, a philosopher, an inventor, and then also an ambassador. So he was involved in going to other countries to represent the United States. There's Thomas Jefferson, this is again a much older picture. This is long after the Revolution. This is painted. He was a very young man at the time of the American Revolution, and he is most famous for writing the Declaration of Independence at the time of the Revolution. And he is known to be a very extremely intelligent young man and well-spoken, and which is why they give him the job to write the Declaration that we'll talk about at length later on. John Adams. John Adams is the one who kind of edits the Declaration. Right? He is an older man by the time of the Revolution. He has been a lawyer his whole life, and lawyers back then had a much more difficult job, I think, in terms of the intellectual requirements to be a lawyer. They had to know a lot more things generally, and they had to know a lot more about law to be a lawyer, because there was no internet, right? And even if it was in a book, it was unlikely that they had the book, because books weren't as common. So they had to know a very great deal and be very intelligent. And so being a lawyer was very often a track to being in a high political office. So he was a lawyer. He was a very successful lawyer. He defended some British soldiers at what ended up being called the Boston Massacre. I know we talked about that once, but I'm not sure you guys remember it. We didn't spend a lot of time on it. But there was kind of a mob of people in Boston in 1770, so 5 years before the war begins. There's a British soldier, and he gets into kind of let's say, a disagreement with some people in the town, and they start yelling at one another, and then some more soldiers come and back him up, and the mob grows to about 100 people from town throwing stuff, snowballs, maybe rocks, we're not sure, and some people end up getting shot. And Adams is the only one in Boston who will defend the soldiers, and he says that even if I disagree with these men, they deserve somebody to defend them. So he defends them, and 6 out of the 8 soldiers go free because they didn't shoot directly into the crowd, and so they are deemed not to have committed any crimes. Anyway, so that's John Adams. He helps to craft the Declaration of Independence and is the 2nd president of the United States. I didn't mention that Thomas Jefferson is the 3rd president. And that, like I said, there's just too many other people to really talk about. This is Samuel Adams. He's the one who called the First Continental Congress. He is a very influential writer at the time of the Declaration of Independence and the Revolution. He writes all the time, and just is very well known for his arguments for freedom. You guys remember John Stark, right? Our famous general. And he had his story about getting captured by the Indians. If you guys remember that, you should tell it to your parents. It's one of my favorite stories of these people. But when he was a young man, he was captured by Indians, and as an older man, he's a general in the Revolutionary War, and is very brave and does a number of great things there. This is Putnam, Israel Putnam. You remember Putnam in The Wolf, where he crawls into the hole to get the wolf, right? He's also a famous general in the Revolution. There's just, like I said, too many others to really talk about. I mean, there's Marion, remember the guy with the tower who built the tower so he could see down into the British fort. He had his men build it overnight. He gets nicknamed the Swamp Fox. There's just dozens of other people we could talk about, and we have talked about this year, but we don't have time to go into all their stories right now. This is King George III, and we didn't spend much time talking about him in class, but King George III is the King of England at the time of the Revolution, and this is a portrait of him at about that time. And he is the one that all the complaints in the Declaration of Independence are against. So we'll talk about those here in a minute. So we have, like I said, there are a number of problems, and we'll talk about all these using the Declaration of Independence. But there are a number of causes that lead up to the war. And I keep referring to the Declaration of Independence, but it's not actually the beginning of the war. If you remember, the Americans expected the British to send troops, and they were waiting for them to land in Massachusetts, Boston, and they had, remember, if you guys remember Paul Revere, right? So Paul Revere and some other men were waiting for the British to land, and then they were going to go warn all of the colonists that the British were coming, that they were bringing an army, and to get ready. And by this time, in 1775, everybody had already been stockpiling weapons and ammunition and all this stuff. So the tensions were high, everybody was ready for war. And then we get the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And this battle is, we talked about this in class, but I'm not sure how much you guys remember, so I'll go over it quickly here. This battle is when the British march to a couple of cities, Lexington and Concord, and the American militia, so the militia are not regular soldiers. You can see they don't have uniforms, they don't get paid to be soldiers, they're just ready to fight for their town typically, and sometimes for the state. The British army marched up the road, and the militia was on the village square with their guns ready and lined up in ranks. And the British told them that they had to disperse, they had to go home, and the militia refused. And nobody is really sure who fired the first shot, but this ends up being the first military engagement of the war. And so the British march down to, they're trying to get to the armory, the store of weapons, and in Concord, and to take those weapons from the colonists. They end up having to march back and getting harassed along the whole way by colonists hiding in trees, hiding in the bushes, shooting over rock walls, this sort of thing. And it goes pretty badly for the British here. But they get reinforcements, and the war goes from there. Before we get into some details about the war, though, now that we've kind of said how it started, I think we need to talk about the reasons it started. This is very important. And here is a nice copy of the Declaration of Independence. So this is actually written by hand. I don't know, you guys can't really see this very well. I don't know if I hold it up closer. You can see just how amazing the writing was. This is written by hand and then signed months after the actual declaration was sent out. You can see famously John Hancock puts his name in giant letters down here at the bottom so that the king, he says, can read it with his spectacles off. He can read it without his glasses on. I mean, sign my name nice and big right at the top. But all these men signed the Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about the Declaration of Independence. We talked about how there's this whole bit at the beginning about why they think they need to give reasons. Right? So most of this is actually a list of reasons. We don't think of it that way, but it is. It's a list of reasons for the Declaration of Separation, of independence from Britain. And it says that they should give reasons because this isn't a thing that happens all the time, right? That most people will suffer evils that are done to them rather than change them easily. And they say that when we have to change them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires they should declare the causes that impel them to the separation. We talked about what that meant, which is that they want everybody in the world, so this declaration is not sent only to the King of England, it's sent to everybody. They want everybody in the world to know why they think they should be independent, free and independent states. So, let's talk about those reasons. And one of the very interesting things about this is that the list of reasons starts off with something like 8 or 9 reasons that all have to do with the king would not allow them to make their own laws. Not that he made other laws for them, but he wouldn't allow them to make any laws. And he did this in a number of different ways. He'd tell them that if they wanted to make laws, they had to make them in places that were really hard to get to and were far away from all of the information they would need to make the laws. Again, remember there's no phones, no internet, so if you need some information to make the law and the information is a 2-day ride away, you got to ride 2 days and get the stuff and then come back 2 days. And so that he would do that. He refused, he said that they had to get his signature on any law and then refused to sign any laws that came to him. He would tell them, okay, this group of people is making bad laws, they all have to go home, they're not allowed to be the lawmakers anymore, and then wouldn't let them have elections to elect new people to make laws. So there's a bunch of different other ones too, but he was basically keeping them from making good laws so that their country, or so that their colonies could run well. And this seems strange. It seems like he would want the colonies to run well. But they put that first, and the next part is what he did instead. So instead of having there be laws, he sent a bunch of officers, is the way it puts it. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. So he just sent a bunch of his lackeys, people from his court, to America and said, you get to just be king there, and whatever you say goes. There aren't any laws, so nobody is running this by law. He won't let them make laws to run the countries, and so they just have to do whatever this officer says. And along with the officers, he sent standing armies. So he sent just standing means that they're always there. They're always ready. It's not like a militia where it's the people who live there are ready to fight. This is an army that's always ready to go. So he sent an army and made the people of the colonies house the soldiers of the army in their own homes. So he wouldn't let them make laws. He made them be ruled by these people from his court and sent soldiers to enforce all this and put the soldiers in the houses of the colonists. Most of these colonies were founded by charters, and we talked about charters a bit before, which is to say the king would give you a piece of paper. It was very pretty and written like this, and on the bottom, instead of John Hancock's signature, it'd have George III, King of England, and the charter would say what land you were allowed to have and what your rights were in that land. So this guy is the governor, and you get to have this land, and here's how you're going to run it, and I'm giving you permission to run this land in this particular way in the colonies of Great Britain. And then George III just said, yeah, those don't count anymore. In several cases, he just removed the charters. So they had a signed document from the king that said this is how things are going to run, and then the king said, yeah, not anymore. We're not doing that. So he removed their charters. We talked a bit about how he cut off their ability to trade with the whole world. So you remember the colonies, we talked about this yesterday, where the colonies can produce a lot of stuff they need, but they also need to be able to trade with the rest of the world to get some of the other things. And so if they can't do that, their lives are much harder, and some places they rely on that, and if they can't trade, they will starve. And so the king said, well, you can't trade with anybody except England. So then you'd have to pay somebody to take the stuff from France you wanted to buy and ship it to England and sell it to somebody in England so that you could buy it from the guy in England. And this was making life quite difficult for a number of the colonists. You remember he kept putting higher and higher taxes on them to pay for the wars that he was waging in Europe. So these are all, I'm not just coming up with these off the top of my head, these are all actually in here. Now this is really hard to read because it's very small. The real paper is much larger and you can read it. But these are all the things they list. He would also, when people were arrested for crimes, he would often make them go across the sea to England in order to be tried for the crime. So to go to court and find out whether you're innocent or guilty, you'd have to sail all the way to England. This would, of course, just ruin your life because it takes, by the time you sail to England, stay in jail there till the trial's ready, go to trial, have your trial. Even if you get set free, even if you find out that you're not guilty, you've lost 6 months and you've been gone from your family and your farm and everything else for 6 months for no reason. At least 6 months, and maybe a year if the weather's not good enough to come back. They also blame him for making Canada, trying to make Canada more powerful, to take over the northern part of the United States. And then again, this is written after the Lexington Concord and some other things, and so they say that he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He's also transporting large armies of mercenaries. We talked about the Hessians, the Germans, right? The German mercenaries that he sent over. And we'll talk more about them when we talk about the Battle of Trenton. But they say he's sending large armies of mercenaries to destroy our cities and lives. He has actually captured Americans and then said, unless you fight for the British on this ship against your fellow Americans, we'll kill you. He also is trying to get the Americans to fight one another. So they say he excited domestic insurrections amongst us. So that means that he tried to get some of the Americans to fight in a war against their own country. And also he's paying the Indians to come and attack them. And so it says he has tried to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So they don't care if you're a child or a woman or an old man, they will just kill you. And again, we talked about this, that there are a number of Indian tribes that are this way, and George was paying those Indian tribes to come attack the Americans. And they say, the final thing they say is that all this is true, but we didn't immediately say, we're not going to obey you anymore. The first thing we did is ask you to fix this. They say, we asked for these things in the most humble terms, but every time we'd ask for you to fix this, you'd make it worse. So, because of all of that, because this seems to just be getting worse and worse and worse, and there does not seem to be a way out for us, we are going to be our own country, and the support of this declaration, they say they rely on the protection of divine providence, so they believe God is on their side, and they mutually pledge to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, which means everything that they have, their reputations, their money, their homes, their families, and their lives, they are saying that they are willing to put all those things on the line for what they think to be an even more important good, which is freedom from the tyranny that King George is exercising over them. So, that's the Declaration of Independence. That's the reasons that they want to separate from the British. Now, we usually hear, I'm sure as you children grow up, and if your parents are listening, as you have gone through your lives, you usually hear the causes of the revolution being things like taxation without representation, right? Too much taxes, too high taxes. And that is one of the things listed, but you'll notice from the list I just gave, it's only one of many, many things. The taxes were a part of it, the cutting off of trade was a part of it, but they were very concerned about the inability to govern themselves according to the charters that they had, and the inability to make laws to govern them rather than being governed by these swarms of officers sent by King George. So, here we go, Declaration of Independence. This is, I forgot to mention, Battle of Lexington and Concord is in April of 1775. So, April 1775, right? And you see here, July 4th, 1776. Now, the Declaration of Independence was, they all agreed on July 2nd, we should declare independence, and they send Thomas Jefferson off to write a draft. He writes a draft of this, and then they take a couple of days to edit it, and then they all agree on it on July 4th and publish it everywhere. So we have April 1775, Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. And then the war is on fully, right? So the Continental Congress starts raising troops, they've already been sort of raising troops, but now they have a declaration from all these people, representatives from all the states, to help raise troops, to raise money, get weapons and guns, cannons and that sort of thing to fight the war. And the British start sending, as they said in the Declaration, more soldiers to come, more mercenaries to come. And one of the first major victories of the war for the Americans comes in December of 1776. This is Christmas Eve. The evening of Christmas, the night after Christmas. George Washington, we talked about this, gets his men, sneaks across the Delaware River in the dead of night, surprises the Hessians after they've been up partying all day and night because it's Christmas, and so they party all day. And then so George Washington sneaks in and surprises them all and wins a great victory at Trenton, and this is called the Battle of Trenton, where he crosses the Delaware. They don't expect him to. Obviously, the river does not look like a nice place to be this time of year, and so they don't expect him to come across in the middle of the night, but he does anyway, and surprises them. And then you remember what happens right after that is he leaves Trenton because he knows there's a bigger army than his, commanded by a British general, Howe, General Howe. And so he leaves Trenton, but Howe finds him and gets in his way. And then they trick them again by leaving all their watchfires burning overnight and walking around Howe's army and attacking Princeton, I believe it was. And he wins another victory there. Yeah. And I meant to print off a picture from the Battle of Princeton because there's a famous picture from there. You can see over here, actually, Washington is here, but his horse is over here. And Washington famously rode around on this white horse all the time so everybody could see where he was, even the enemy, which, that's not the smartest thing if you want to be not shot at. But he'd ride around on this big white horse and get shot at all the time, and somehow survived. So, there you go. There's the crossing of the Delaware. The next big thing we want to talk about is Valley Forge. There's a couple of things that are important about this. This is in the winter of 1777 to 1778. Okay? So a couple of things about Valley Forge. One is Washington stays with his troops all winter. Remember, Valley Forge is terrible. Nobody has enough clothes. Nobody has enough food. It's cold. It's one of the coldest winters on record. They're starving. They're freezing. Everybody's getting sick. It is just miserable. And Washington doesn't leave. He stays with his troops and suffers with his troops. And for this reason, his troops it's stuff like this that Washington does all the time that make his troops love him. And he is the most loved man. They say after the war that he is first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. And so it's stuff like this that makes him that. But the other thing that's important is this is when the French show up. We talked about how the Germans are getting involved by sending mercenaries with the British, right? But that's not really the German government, that's just German mercenaries. This is the French government decides to get involved, and this is Lafayette. And remember, Lafayette shows up and helps Washington. Lafayette and, what's the other guy's name? Oh, no, I can't remember. There's a German guy who also shows up and helps them to train the troops. So they show up, they help them train the troops, and so by the time they come out of Valley Forge in the spring, they're actually a much better army, which is great. But the other thing that's even more important about this is that France and England in 1777, 1778 get into a war in Europe and in the Caribbean. And so Britain gets distracted or needs to put its troops elsewhere. And so this is an enormous help to the American cause. The biggest battle in the Revolutionary War is not fought in the United States and involves no Americans. It's a naval battle between the British and French in Grenada, I think, that just is this huge battle, and it's the worst defeat the British Navy has suffered in 100 years. And so it really helps the American cause to have the French show up, especially the Navy. Right? We talked about blockades before, and the British, remember, were blockading the whole coast of the United States. So it made it really hard to get supplies, to get this sort of thing in and out. And the French Navy really helps to combat the British Navy, because the Americans we're not even in the same league as the British Navy. The British Navy is one of the best navies in the world, maybe the best navy in the world at the time, and the Americans barely have a navy. We have a bunch of merchant ships. So the French are the only way that we are actually able to compete with the British Navy at all. And there's a bunch of naval battles that happen between the British and French during the Revolutionary War. So the French really help shift the tide of the war toward the American side. So there's a lot of other stuff, and I would love to talk to you about it, but it would take forever and we would never be done. So we're going to skip to the end. This is the surrender of the British at Yorktown, right? So there's a lot of other fighting that goes on all up and down the country. Like I said, we have the Swamp Fox all the way down in Georgia. We've got General Stark all the way up in New Hampshire, and everything in between. There's just everywhere. This is a countrywide fight. Everybody is involved. In 1783, so we're skipping, like I said, 5 years here of war, we have the British surrender at Yorktown. And the Americans win the war. Washington accepts the surrender of the British. The British lay down their arms, and they mostly go home. as we know, and as we'll talk about tomorrow, they don't entirely go home. The War of 1812 is partly because they didn't entirely go home, but mostly they leave, and they go home, and they recognize in a treaty soon after this that the United States is an independent country. So the United States operates from 1774 to 1770 or to 1789 under what's called the Articles of Confederation, which is we're a confederation of independent states, and then in 1789 we get the Constitution that we currently have. So we'll talk more about the Constitution next time, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and some frontier settlement. I know that's a lot, but it's all a lot. So we'll get all that wrapped up tomorrow, and yeah, look forward to that.